What is Latinidad? It is a social construct, and yet it has very real implications to experiences of folks. It's not a race, and yet so many people think of it as. The La Casa PLs and I were recently discussing this, and one of them said, you know what, we're just all confused. And to be frank, it's the most honest and appropriate definition or description of Latinidad I've heard in quite a while. So today we aim to have a discussion of where we review the history of this term, some aims at intentionally erase Black and Indigenous groups from Latinidad, research on Latinx college students, and commitments that La Casa has made and continues to make to craft space for these conversations and to center the experiences and narratives of Afro-Latinxes. This is a first in a series of conversations as part of our themes, our year-long theme called Unpacking Latinidad, Race, Colorism, and Radical Solidarity. As we dive into this topic, it's important to note that as facilitators, we have done research, we have done self-reflection, and our work is still limited through our positionalities. After all, we are not experts, but we are members of the general US Latinx community through our lived experiences. For these reasons, as we introduce ourselves, we will state the identities that come at the forefront for us and what questions we still have or what areas we wish to explore this year along with you. I am Dean Eileen Galvez, and I use she and ella pronouns, and I have the honor and privilege of being directora of La Casa Cultural de Julia de Burgos. Now, that's my official title. As an individual person, I am a fair-skinned US Salvadoreña, and it is important that I include the United States in there because while I may be the daughter of refugees from El Salvador, I had a very different experience growing up in the United States and having citizenship privilege my entire life. Speaking of, I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, and I also have regional experiences in Texas, Illinois, and Connecticut, which are all colonized lands. I am also a cis woman, and that means that I identify with the gender I was assigned with at birth. I am also a sister to 5 brothers. I'm a tia, a friend, a classmate, and colleague. Something that I'm personally interested in learning more about this year is the experiences of Black Central Americans and the erasure that happens within Latinidad in Latin America and in the United States. So up next, I will give up the floor to our Assistant Director, Carolina Dávila.
Saludos, everyone. My name is Carolina. I use she, ella pronouns. And as Dean Eileen Galvez mentioned, I'm the Assistant Director of La Casa, where I have been working for now, entering low-key my senior year, so my 4th year at Yale. Beyond that, I am Afro-Boricua, which means I'm a Black Puerto Rican of mixed race and fair skin. I was born and raised in the island of Puerto Rico up until about middle school, the age of 12. And at that point, I moved to Boston, Massachusetts. So I'm definitely a Northeast girl up and down the East Coast with some time in Florida as well as Philadelphia. I'm a first-generation low-income graduate and a proud alum of public school systems from K through 12 up until my bachelor's degree from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. All of that was followed by an Ivy League master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania. I am a cis straight woman in an interracial and interethnic marriage with a dark-skinned African-American man. And so him and his family are a huge part of my own understanding of my own Blackness as it develops throughout the years. We are certainly not experts in this topic, and including myself in that statement. So most of my ties when it comes to La Casa's theme this year, as well as today's topic, is truly through personal lived experiences and enhanced by professional ventures that I've had specifically for the past 4 to 5 years. And these include various conference sessions, presentations, webinars, and panels, both as a participant as well as a host and organizer. And the conversations truly center mostly Afro-Latinidad and more recently, anti-Blackness in the Latinx community. So when it comes to my own learning and unlearning this year, besides my personal journey as a Puerto Rican woman, one, learning how to share more space with other nations of Latin America. So really quoting Dean Eileen Galvez, when she's talking about Black Central Americans, I recognize that that's something that I also need to make more space for. And I am personally interested in the experiences of administrators, staff, and faculty that are Black Latinxes in spaces of higher education. So up next is our wonderful colleague, Jorge.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Jorge Anaya. I use he, ed pronouns. I am the Woodbridge Fellow for the Yale College Dean's Office and the Burgos Center for Teaching and Learning. I also work as the coordinator of the Community Initiative, which is Yale's administrative effort to empower first-gen low-income students on campus. So aside from being a university administrator, some of my key identities are that I am a cisgendered male. I'm a fair-skinned Mexican-American dual citizen. I'm actually still grappling with my racial identity and my subsequent whiteness, and that's one of the key reasons why I'm very thankful to be a part of this series, mostly just because a lot of the work that we've done has led me to a lot of interpersonal reflection, and that's something that I think that we can all do, and something that I'm really grateful for just the opportunity to do at this scale. A bit more about me. I grew up in a low-income background with undocumented parents in Los Angeles. So yeah, definitely the transition to the East Coast was very difficult at first, but now here I am in my 6th year, and I feel like this is definitely home away from home. Luckily, my parents were actually able to obtain the residency as of 2 years ago, and that's something that is very important to us and something that definitely impacted my life growing up, and definitely like the way I view US relationships with other states or other countries. Lastly, I'm also a first generation low income student. I'm a Yale graduate from the class of 2019. And yeah, that's basically me.
So now you know our names, but I'd also like to take this opportunity for you to know the names of the lands that we reside on. This is actually Yale's official statement that says, Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Squaticoke, Golden Hill Pagasit, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. In addition, we want to acknowledge the violence of chattel slavery that occurred against both Black and Indigenous communities in what is currently the United States. Many of the infrastructures you see or have used on college campuses and beyond were built on their displacement, genocide, and enslavement. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. And we also encourage ongoing reflection and action toward anti-colonial efforts. This last part was inspired by statements shared at the American College Personnel Association National Convention of 2020. If you are interested in learning about the Indigenous lands that you reside on, I encourage you to check out this great resource, which is native-land.ca, where you can learn and do some research into the history.
Thank you so much. So yeah, we also wanted to give a bit of context setting as to why we're having this specific session. So alongside the current public health pandemic, we're also currently in the middle of a racial pandemic. To understand our community's role and complicity in the overt anti-Blackness that is visible in today's society, we must question who we are and how we choose to describe ourselves. Are our identity markers inherently anti-Black? Have you heard people in your home whisper about someone's Blackness? Does an Afro-Latinx person come to mind when thinking of the Latinx community? Why are there attempts to gatekeep a Black person's Latinidad? In order to combat the anti-Blackness in the Latinx community, we must first question our most salient identity, Latinidad. This session will question the rhetoric and terms that we often use in a US-focused lens. We hope to demonstrate how specific word choice, whether consciously or unconsciously, can perpetuate anti-Blackness. In order to unpack Latinidad, we must first understand 3 specific terms: race, colorism, and colonization. Each term plays an important role in defining Latinidad if it hypothetically exists. The terms and concepts we will describe are not rigid, but rather have fuzzy borders. For the context of this workshop, we will attempt to define these terms in accordance to their relevance to Latinidad, and we willingly admit that they are not fully encompassing. After all, these terms cannot be defined in the light of only one context or background. To begin our discussion on Latinidad, we thought it would be useful to begin with a brief historical context and an attempt to define race, colorism, and colonization. Again, these definitions will be very specific to the topic on hand and are not meant to be taken as strict definitions. We hope to show each term's role in the development of the Latinidad identity. Because none of these definitions are absolute, as they're also based on our personal limited experience, I would like to remind y'all that your lived experience can also help you navigate some of this terminology. So our first definition our first term is race. It is nearly impossible to define race without mentioning ethnicity. Though there can be some overlap between race and ethnicity, the terms are not interchangeable. The word race is often used to define someone by their skin color and physical attributes. For example, Black, Asian, or white. In essence, this is how someone may be perceived by society through their phenotypical characteristics. The word ethnicity most often refers to the way in which one identifies learned aspects of themselves, i.e. their nationality, language, and culture. For example, Latino, Jewish, or West Indian. The terms Hispanic or Latinx denote ethnicity. Latinx Americans belong to many racial groups. A simple example of this may be the Spaniards, as they are part of the Hispanic community due to their shared common language of Spanish, but they are not Latinx. At the end of the day, speaking Spanish, a cultural trait, does not absolve anyone of one's whiteness or does not diminish one's whiteness. By definition, ethnicity is tied to culture, and culture is not inherited, but rather constructed as a combination of rituals, language, practices, and traditions that are learned and interpreted with each generation. As a consequence, there remains confusion regarding the definition of ethnicity, even for the sole government body responsible for ethnic and racial classification, the US Census. So at this time, I do want to quickly remind y'all that we are very much so focused on a US-centric lens when defining race for this specific workshop or discussion. But by US definitions, race can be seen through a binary lens, either being Black or white. This had led many Latinos to historically browning themselves to be a part of the discussion of race, as in the US, as they are often excluded in the US due to this binary. However, this creates a very narrow perception of what Latinidad is, and in essence alienates non-brown Latinx as a result of varying phenotypes perceptions of what Latinidad is. This is also a result of the perception of whiteness and Blackness needed to be expanded further than the Anglo-American, North American definitions. When you think of whiteness, do you think of an Anglo-American? And if so, can those definitions be expanded? The same applies to many Afro-Latinx individuals. When you think of a Black person, do you think of African Americans, or do Afro-Latinos also come to mind? In this way, we have to expand both whiteness and Blackness to be fully encompassing of individuals who are not just from the North American region. And we would like to remind y'all that you can be any race and still be ethnically part of a certain group. I think when it comes to Latinidad, a lot of, let's say, like white Latinx individuals are fearful of embracing their whiteness because they think that it might strip them from like their ethnic card, or they might not be invited to like La Carne Asada or something like that. But we want to remind y'all that whiteness does not chip away at your ethnic cultural background. And for that reason, it is very important that Latinos can be part of any race. The next term I would like to define is colorism. Colorism is referred to as the process and practices of discrimination that privileges people of color with lighter skin over those with darker skin. Colorism practices assign advantages to those that most closely resemble a white individual. For this reason, a person's race plays a critical factor in how they experience colorism. White Latinx individuals can benefit from their white privilege granted by by colorism in society. Therefore, it is always important that people openly accept their whiteness to see how they can be complicit, whether unconsciously or consciously, in white privilege and subsequent anti-Blackness. Colorism can, however, go beyond focusing on one's skin color. Accordingly, hair type, body type, facial features such as the shape of the nose and fullness of the lips may influence the views where one sits on the color spectrum. This can be visible in very white-centered or white European-centric standards of beauty, and it definitely plays into eugenics. As you can see in the diagram, asking a Black woman, why don't you do something with your hair, is an example of a coloristic question based off racism, as it's an attempt to have Black women assimilate into Eurocentric standards of beauty and professionalism. Yeah, colorism was a result of the social standards imposed through colonialism, and Latin America was specifically impacted by colonialism and accompanying belief system that introduced whiteness as superior, privileged, and more attractive. Consequently, Latinxes that have phenotypes that fall into extremes, either the darkest or the lightest, are particularly likely to experience advantages as well as marginalization. There have actually been studies conducted that show that at higher SES levels, which are socioeconomic status levels, medium and dark skinned Latinas report higher discrimination, whereas light and lightest skinned Latinas do not. Also, it is shown that as lighter skin tones may be particularly valued in Latin America, Latinxes that are foreign born, as opposed to US born, may have internalized color biases more strongly. This is because colorism is not just exclusive to society as a whole, but can rather infiltrate a familial unit. So in the next slide, familismo is a strong commitment to family and community, which has been proven to be instrumental in Latinx's educational success. While the positive role of the family has been established, the impact of colorism within family units has largely been unnoticed. Few scholars identify how colorism at home impacts Afro-Latinx's sense of self and cultural pride. So a classic example of colorism in many Latinx families is when, new babies are born. I think many times in my own family, I have definitely heard people describe newborns as like, oh, like, mira que bonito, but like, te salió moreno. Or like, and sometimes if the baby's whiter, they'll be like, oh, like, que bonito, y está güerito, like, que suertudo, or something like that, and they're very happy at having like those white phenotypical characteristics from the moment of birth. So this is a very classic example of colorism in the family, in the familial unit from the moment of birth. Latinx individuals' worth can be, alongside their sense of beauty, be impacted directly through colorism. And there has to be a bit more research conducted to actually show the direct aftermath of the influence of colorism in a sense of family. And again, I do want to remind y'all that statements such as, this baby is really, really cute, but it's a little too dark, is filled with colorism and anti-Black and Indigenous sentiments. So yeah, now I'm going to pass it back on to Dean Eileen Galvez for the definition of colonialism. Oh, sorry, colonization.
Thank you, Jorge. As Jorge mentioned, these concepts are interrelated and they really stem from colonization. So we think that it's important that we not only acknowledge this, but to provide some terminology and history of where it came from. Boveda states that colonization refers to a group of people invading a space that is not their own and to which they are not indigenous to. In addition to usurping indigenous spaces, colonizers steal resources and enslave or subjugate people to support and propagate their own cultural values, knowledges, and practices. Critical in noting is that colonization is not something that just lives in the past. As we stated in our land acknowledgement, we continue to reside on occupied indigenous lands, and therefore colonization continues to be a project. When we speak of colonization in the US American imaginary, often we think about Christopher Columbus, who in 1492 lost himself at sea and landed at Hispaniola. It is a misconception that he arrived in land that today we know as the United States. However, in 1607, the colonization of Turtle Island, today known as the United States, began with the arrival of 104 colonial settlers to lands that they would rename to Jamestown, home to the Powhatan and Monacan tribes, among others. 12 years later, in 1619, more than 20 enslaved Africans were sold to these colonists. Tied to this history is the role of colleges. In 1636, the first college in the continent, Harvard, was established. And according to Wilder, soon after, Yale, King's College, which is now Columbia, Queens College, which is now Rutgers, and other colleges were instruments of Christian expansionism, weapons for the conquest of indigenous peoples, and major beneficiaries of the African slave trade and slavery. As I mentioned, colonization is a continuous project. In 1898, after the Spanish-American War, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines became US territories. The impacts are clearly seen today. For example, you heard from Carolina that she's Boricua from the island. Here in the mainland, Carolina has special privileges such as voting. This is not something that she would have if she were in the island. And what I just shared with you is admittedly a much too shortened timeline, and it is made way too simple. And in fact, to even frame our origins and identity around colonization is also problematic and perpetuates erasure of Black and Indigenous peoples of our ancestral homelands. I would encourage you all to look into the histories of the land you occupy if you are not Indigenous. Read from Indigenous scholars, community leaders, and peoples. There is so much history that for many of us, at least in my public school education, it wasn't available to me. But we have the capacity to change that for ourselves. So back to Latinidad. It is a colonial concept. And at the top of this presentation, I mentioned to you that we're all confused. And I really, truly mean that. We're all confused. And this image reflects how complicated and layered it is. It's an identity that was fabricated, and to its aims of racial order has erased Black and Indigenous peoples and experiences. I'd like to give credit for this image or GIF to Dr. Jasmine Haywood, who shared this image in a recent webinar on anti-Blackness in Latinidad. Up next, Carolina will review historical origins of this.
Thank you, Dean Eileen Galvez. And so as we're continuing to think about these identities and these experiences mentioned, in order to better understand today's demographics, we need to know our journeys, including painful ones like the transatlantic slave trade. So in the next slide, you will see an image of a map. And this map was brought to you by the Smithsonian Magazine. You can find it online. But basically, this map is showing you the thickness in the arrows. The arrows show obviously the direction of the ships, and the thickness shows you the amounts. So more specifically, volume and direction of the transatlantic slave trade from all African countries and regions to all American regions. And I really want to challenge us that when we're saying American, we're talking about Las Americas. So North America, Central America, South America, as well as the Caribbean, not just the United States. In the next slide, you'll see a quote by Dr. Busey and Dr. Cruz. specifically highlighting that 91% of enslaved Africans were taken to Latin America and the Caribbean. So that is a vast majority of enslaved Africans ended up not necessarily in the United States or North America. Yet we continue to downplay and erase our African heritage to this day in a variety of ways. So in preparation for this presentation, I was thinking, what are these variety of ways? And the first example that came to mind is in Puerto Rico, there's a popular expression that goes, ¿Y tu abuela? ¿A dónde está? Which translates to, and your grandma, where is she? This quote came from a popular poem that basically asks, why are you hiding your Black grandma in the back of the house or the room as a way to deny your Black ancestry and align yourself to whiteness? Those aren't the exact words, obviously, but that's the essential message that you get through that poem. And it's been since the 20th century that the poem was around. So it's really not a new conversation that we're having. And then finally, I wanted to highlight the screenshot at the bottom, which is an image from a time lapse where you can click on the link once this becomes available and essentially see the movement of the ships in the span of 350 years. Next slide. So Afro and Black Latinx identity and experiences, I want to name the fact that the research is certainly developing, but I do name the fact that it is still limited. So a big shout out again to Dr. Jasmine Haywood, as Dean Eileen Galvez mentioned earlier, as well as Dr. Claudia Garcia Lewis, who are the main two names that you'll see, in addition to a few other scholars that we're going to rely on for the next information. And a lot of the information is also based on my own personal lived experiences, as well as our own La Casa student anecdotes. So identity. The quotes you see on the screen pretty much help us understand a little bit of how to define this language. But again, relying on what Jorge laid out in our context setting, this is only some language, acknowledging the fact that it's limited in scope, nuances, language is always evolving, and there's room for personal interpretation. So in the first one, it says Afro-Latinxes are defined as people of African descent in Mexico, Central and South America, and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, and by extension, those of African descent in the United States, whose origins are in Latin America and the Caribbean. The second quote reads, the term of Afro-Latino indicates that Blackness as a racial identity can apply to a variety of ethnicities, and Latinidad as an ethnicity can comprise individuals of an assortment of races. And I want to emphasize Haywood's words there because it's just another reminder that Latinx is an ethnicity, not a race. And the Blackness is the race that comprises of Afro-Latinidad. So I think there's a conception of Latinxes in the United States specifically really browning ourselves as a monolith in order to be a part of racial conversations, but it's important to realize that Latinx is not a race. Next slide. So when it comes to a little bit of data that we found, Howard percentages that you see on the left quote, it seems like different surveys highlight that Afro-Latinos in the US population as a whole, so beyond US Latinxes, ranges from 0.5% to 6%. And when we think about 6% of the US population as a whole potentially identifying as Afro-Latinx, that's comparable to the Asian American population in this country. And the image on the right is the result from a 2011 to 2014 survey conducted by the Pew Research Center. And it highlights that about a quarter of US Latinxes or Hispanics identify as Afro-Latino, which is a significant growth from what we've seen in past data. So we have all these beautiful numbers that kind of paint a little bit of a picture, but it's really important for us to look beyond the quantitative and consider the qualitative lived experiences and narratives of the folks that have these identities. So in the first quote, you see the frequent dynamic of Afro-Latinxes being mistaken for Anglo-Blacks in their own Latino communities is emblematic of the foreignness of Blackness to Latinos. In the second quote, the stereotypic image of Latinxes being people with olive skin tones, dark brown flowy hair, and brown eyes aids in the construct of Latinidad being decidedly non-Black and in significant ways discursively anti-Black. And so when it comes to these experiences of, once again, viewing Latinidad and Blackness as mutually exclusive, I automatically think again of past experiences that either I've had or some of my colleagues have had. So comments like, but you don't look Latinx, which isn't helpful to hear, one, but two, probably very much supported by our Google image search, that when you look up Latinx, you don't see folks like myself or even with darker skin. When you look at Univision, Telemundo, and any media and pop culture representations of Latinidad, or depending on the region of the country that I visit, most of the time my name automatically gets changed to Carolina because of the way I look. But more importantly, they get very surprised when I start speaking in Spanish, and they're like, oh, wait, what? Where's this coming from? And it's like, that's actually my native tongue. And they were like, wait, so you didn't learn that in college, you mean to tell me? It's like, no, I was born in Puerto Rico, grew up, that's the first language I knew, and then moved to the United States. So again, just some anecdotes thinking about how it's just impossible for Black people to know Spanish. Next slide. So obviously we're in a college setting. Dean Eileen Galvez highlighted a little bit about the colonization and its historical ties within institutions. And so we wanted to also highlight Afro-Latinx experiences within higher education specifically. And spoiler alert, big surprise, there's really limited research on Afro-Latinx, Black Latinx college experiences. Dr. Haywood says, Afro-Latinos have encountered almost complete invisibility and neglect as a conceivable constituent of either the Latino or Black population in higher education research. Garcia, Lewis, and Cortez pretty much highlight that most of the literature when it comes to students of color is super monoracial, meaning let's just put everybody together in this one students of color category, which doesn't necessarily highlight the nuances within everybody's experiences or needs and trends. Or the other side is that it puts Latinx students in one category and Black students in another category, and the data then becomes very mutually exclusive, and we lose the experiences of Afro-Latinx students. Following that, you'll see that most studies on Latinx students are actually from Mexican students, and Mexican students have been researched to least likely identify as Afro-Latinx. And I think we can tie that a little bit to the colonial histories within Latin America and the structures that support anti-Blackness. So for example, in Mexico, in 2015, there was a survey that estimated Afro-Mexican population to be about 1.3 million people in the country. Through ongoing activism and advocacy, and thanks to that, the results of that survey, it wasn't until 2020, so this very year, that the census marks the first time the country is counting its Afro-Mexican population, providing official recognition for a people often overlooked in the Mexican cultural mosaic. So that's really important for us to know that when we're thinking about Latinx students, most of the narrative is Mexican students, and then they're least likely to identify as Afro-Mexican, Afro-Latinx. And on the flip side, when we're thinking about Black student research, we're mostly focusing on African-American experiences, which doesn't necessarily capture the global Blackness that we understand today, including transnationalism, cultural markers, language, and the like. Now, next slide. So some themes that came from a lot of the research that we've been doing in regards to Afro-Latinx discrimination is the fact that a lot of it is based on various markers. So it definitely goes beyond skin tone, highlighting again what Jorge was mentioning earlier about where there's hair texture, nose shape, lips, but also cultural markers. So affiliation with Spanish, who do you hang out with, what spaces do you occupy, and the like. A lot of Afro-Latinx students, and I found this true still to this day with myself, is that we carry familial notions of anti-Blackness. So we're not necessarily immune to carrying rhetoric around anti-Blackness and internalized racism. And so that really impacts how it is that we view ourselves, understand ourselves, our self-perception, confidence, etc. And then college, known to be a time where students are really discovering themselves, exploring, and defining who it is that they are, often find themselves going back home to engage in really honest and difficult conversations with their families to do that educating about historical knowledge on Afro-Latinidad and claiming Blackness or aligning with whiteness. And it can be a very solitary experience for a lot of students. Next, forced to choose often between Latinx or Black, which we already know, but with this forcing of choosing, they're also facing rejection from both groups. So obviously kind of thinking about Ansaldúa borderlands, ni de aquí, ni de allá. Like, I'm not from here, I'm not from there either. I'm just like kind of in the middle. These students are often called to address anti-Black racism in the Latinx community, which I think has been the theme this summer for sure. Myself included, even as an administrator, a lot of conversations on it with not just family, but webinars, panels, and the like. So they're doing that educating, but also within the Black community, having to address anti-Latinx sentiments. So it's doubled the educational tax rolls that we put on Black Latinx students, even though we're rejecting them from both groups, which is interesting. And then finally, a quote from that came through Haywood's research from a student ended up being a title and an overall theme within the dissertation, but also a title for a separate article. Latino spaces have been the most violent to Afro-Latinx students. And so as La Casa Cultural, mentioning this is important because we are a Latinx space and that is the history that we have. So how is it that we've been causing harm, and how is it that we can continue improving in our services, efforts, representation, and making space for these students? I'll transition to even an alumni experience. So Marco Davis is Yale College class of 92. And back in 2014, through Yale alumni communications, he had a hard time trying to pretty much embrace and own his own Afro-Latinidad. As you can see, he laughed when he recalled the length that he went to in touch with Black and Latino alumni groups when he graduated from Yale. More specifically, he would alternate every other year, marking himself as either Latino Hispanic one year and then the next year Black, in order to hear from these respective groups, because he couldn't belong to both within the system that in 2014 we were using for alumni communications. If you want to know more about Marco Davis, he is an active alum, and he will actually be our featured alumni speaker for oral history series in the spring semester. So stick around to definitely learn more about his narrative, story, and experiences. But we can't get stuck in all the bad news. Like, this is a lot, these are heavy times, so we gotta make sure that it's not just the deficit perspective. So where's the empowerment, where's the upliftment? And we are always solution-oriented people. And when we take ownership of our own narratives, all the magic that we can do. So in the research, it seems to be a theme that Afro-Black Latinx students tend to thrive within the borderlands, even though it is viewed sometimes as a limiting factor. That's where they also found empowerment. More specifically, that's where in that darkness of borderlands is where they paved their own path and pretty much took ownership of their own journey. So in the next slide, you'll see some examples of what that experience is. The themes that came about is Black Latinx students really engage in self-teaching as a tool of empowerment, specifically accessing information that has been denied to them. For me, that's looked like going to sessions when available, that's going through Google searches, that's also embracing untraditional sources of knowledge, whether that's social media or just community members, and engaging in dialogue with them. Affirmation through courses was a high key theme for most of these students. Anytime there is a class offered, and I've seen this at Yale too, that centers Afro-Latinx anything, whether that's literature, identity, there's one guest speaker coming this one awkward day in time, folks will skip lunch and go to that. That's where a lot of students are feeling most affirmed, because again, it goes back to representation and highlighting narratives and learning histories, especially when the rest of the institution is lacking that, and the rest of the world, essentially. Next is rejecting anti-Black narratives. And I think as college students find their voice, they also gain the confidence to combat negative notions, whether it is with peers, whether it's with families, or just general policies and structures that we need to address. Asserting Afro-Latinidad, we see this a lot. I think I've done this myself. Back when I started grad school is when I noticed how different my Latinidad was, because most of my classmates who were Latinx, which there was 5 out of 50 of us, so we weren't rolling deep. The other 4 were mostly from the West Coast, and they were all Mexican-American. And just noticing 1, East Coast difference, 2, the Caribbean difference, but 3, the Blackness really came to light. And so asserting Afro-Latinidad for me has been that I don't relax my hair for the last, I want to say 6 years. And I just wear it as you see it in this video today, big hair, poofy, curly, and embracing other features within myself, but also engaging with students when they're ready to engage in their own discovery of their Blackness, how it is that they want to express it. And so you see a lot of that happening in college settings. And then finally, creating new spaces. I kind of got this from Dean Eileen Galvez, like when there's not a space, you kind of make it. So for me, that's looked like making a chat with fellow Afro-Latinx, Black Latinx administrators in higher ed to be in community with each other. And we see that through kind of like the pictures that you see on the screen. So on the bottom is a group of folks at the Julia is Black Celebrating Afro-Latinidad event that was created by students. And the right, you see a flyer, Blackness in the Americas, that's all led by student orgs because they wanted to go deeper than just one event. They wanted to host a series of events. And then finally, for myself, a presentation that I did in the past with a colleague on Afro-Latinidad in higher ed, because nobody was talking about it, especially in Region 1. So I think this is a good transition for Dean Eileen Galvez to talk to us about La Casa's commitments.
La Casa is a place of gathering for students, faculty, staff, and New Haven community members. And to that end, we carry a responsibility to continually work towards increasing accessibility, inclusion of all Latinxes, and especially invisibilized groups, and to have intentional conversations that explore these topics. All of this starts with the founding of this center. La Casa Cultural de Julia de Burgos at Yale was originally established by Puerto Rican student activists from the college and the law school. After many years of advocating for a dedicated space for Puerto Rican students and community members, in 1977, alum Orlando Rivera, an Afro-Latino himself, toured 3 different spaces with Yale President Kingman Brewster. Rivera chose 301 Crown Street, knowing that it had been formerly used by the Yale Psychology Department, and believing that this space was used to develop the birth control pill that sterilized Puerto Rican women in the island, Rivera wanted to reclaim this space. La Casa Cultural de Julia de Burgos became the first building on Yale's campus to bear the name of a woman of color, and specifically an Afro-Latina. De Burgos was a beloved feminist poet and continues to be a point of pride for Puerto Ricans and the island and across the globe. She has continued to inspire representation at La Casa. A few years ago, alumna Alejandra Padín-Dujon of the class of 2018 proposed the idea to create the series that Carolina talked to you about, Julia is Black. It was an initiative between La Casa and the House, and continues to take place each semester during our respective heritage and history months, meant to increase awareness and celebrate Afro-Latinidad. Past events include a panel on Afro and Black Latinx students, staff, and faculty, educational and interactive events around food, music, and cultural practices rooted in Latin America's African ancestry, and programs tied to Julia de Burgos herself and her experiences, including mental health, institutional racism, and poetry. Since 2018, student organizations across the Cultural Center have hosted events as part of the Blackness in the Americas series, later expanded to be the Blackness, Indigeneity, and Latinidad in the Americas series, led by the Dominican Student Association. Our focus for 2019-2020 school year was Decolonize La Casa, where we centered conversations about anti-Blackness, Indigenous erasure, and the exclusion of queer and trans folks within our community. Some of these event speakers included KP Martinez, who presented Negra Necia, Anti-Blackness and Gender Policing and Afro-Latinidad, Alan Palaez Lopez, who did a talk and poetry reading for our Julia de Burgos birthday poetry showcase, Paola Velez, who did a lunch discussion and cooking demo for the Chewing the Fat, Cooking Across the Black Diaspora series in collaboration with Yale Sustainability Food Program and the House. And lastly, an Afro-Latinx party and playlist and celebration in collaboration with the House and the Black Student Alliance at Yale, otherwise known as BSA. This year's theme, as we mentioned earlier, is Unpacking Latinidad, Race, Colorism, and Radical Solidarity. And it will be a continuation of last year's conversations and efforts, specifically focusing on anti-Blackness and centering Afro and Black Latinx's voice and experiences. The things that we will do this year and that we have already started, the 3 of us have taken time to meet weekly, to self-reflect, attend webinars, do research, create our own Afro-Latinx literature review So we're putting lots of resources together, and we will be sharing this throughout the year. Student organizations are also aligning their efforts with our theme and increasing initiative after our Latinx Heritage Month kickoff, which I will tell you a little bit about shortly. And lastly, we are creating virtual spaces specifically dedicated to Afro and Black Latinx students to be in community, because we also feel that there should be a space where they don't feel that they have to educate us light folks. Now, the major speakers for this fall semester include Dr. Amala Dache, whose talk, La lucha por libertad y solidaridad, an Afro-Cuban American theory of calle, will be moderated by alumna Yvette Esteban of the Yale College class of 2018. On September 30th, we will have Dr. Paul Joseph Lopez Oro, who will be presenting Black Central Americans in the United States, Mestizaje and Anti-Blackness, and that conversation will be moderated by our own student coordinator, Celia Cacho. And lastly, as far as major speakers, we will have the amazing Doctora Rosa Clemente for 2 days and closing out Latinx Heritage Month, and we'll be discussing civic engagement and Afro-Latinidad. But we don't want these to be just a check marks. We don't want this to just be, oh, here's a great speaker, come and watch. We really want these conversations to continue. And as such, the week after each speaker, we will have community conversations which you can be a part of, and you can bring your positionalities, your identities, you can bring your questions, things that you're confused about, because truly learning happens in community spaces, and we want to provide that intimate space for you all. So look out in our newsletter for more information to be a part of these conversations. And lastly, please know that this work is continuous. It doesn't end here. And it's not gonna take a 1 year long theme. It's not gonna take 2. It's gonna take truly a lifetime commitment as individuals, but also for this to be an imperative mission of La Casa Cultural for the ages to come. Until we dismantle anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, we have a responsibility to continue to push and make more inclusive spaces for all Latinxes. So we really hope that you can join us. Once again, we are not experts, but we're here in the process of learning with you all. And we look forward to seeing you in our themed events.
So I know we just threw a lot of information at you right now, and it might be a bit overwhelming. So for that reason, we wanted to give a quick summary or just main takeaways from this discussion that we hope will help you in your reflection later on. So just as in summary, a reminder that Latinidad is not associated to one race in specific, but much rather associated to one's ethnic or cultural background. For that reason, Latinidad is not just comprised of speaking of one sole language, but rather individuals who speak multiple languages, including Portuguese, indigenous languages, and other languages spoken within the Latin American region do comprise Latinidad as well.
As a love note to fellow Black Latinxes, it's just a friendly reminder that you're not alone. I'm here, we're out here, and we're definitely here beyond trauma, trials, and tribulations. Beyond healing, we have a lot of celebrating to do, so I very much look forward to being in community with you. And to our non-Black Latinx folks, you are certainly invited to the party and the table to engage with us in this work.
And as a final reminder, these reflections may be uncomfortable for yourself and with your loved ones. And trust me, we understand, we feel you. And yet these conversations also help build bridges and are rooted in radical solidarity. So let's spread the love.